in a surprisingly right translated 40-day cycle, which raises a few question marks about the analysis, and is heading down now towards an 80-day trough, okay, which is expected really any time about now and might have occurred yesterday. Okay, there's a potential trough over there. If price starts bouncing up again, then according to this we would say it's very likely that the 80-day cycle trough has come in. So in terms of the cyclic picture, what are we expecting now? Well, according to this analysis, we're expecting price to bounce fairly soon out of a trough, which will probably be a trough of 80-day magnitude. How has this happened? We'll turn on our FLDs, and the 80-day cycle trough, when it crosses the 80-day FLD, which you can see on the chart there, would confirm the positioning of that 80-day cycle trough. Because of the principles of synchronicity and harmonicity, you can pop up the FLD of the 40-day cycle, and when price crosses the 40-day cycle FLD, we will know that a trough of at least 40-day cycle magnitude has occurred. And therefore, according to this analysis, that must be the synchronous trough with the 80-day cycle trough that we are expecting. And we're expecting it to occur this week, basically, or if not this week, then certainly very early next week. Okay. That's according to this analysis. So, and then what's going to happen? Well, of course, price will bounce up, and it will then be the 60-day cycle, which will conclude with the price falling into the 40-week cycle trough expected, as you can see from this circle and whiskers over here. It's expected anytime late May, June, July, and you can see there is a staggered nest of lows that is presented on the chart. So in other words, we're expecting the market in very simplistic terms to bounce up. There should be a bearish underlying trend, so it should form an early peak. And then it's going to head down, probably lower than current levels, a 40-week cycle trough in summer of the northern hemisphere of this year. Okay. John says Facebook IPO to set up the next 5-week cycle high and then down into the 40-week lows in June. So that's a really interesting suggestion, because we are expecting the next 5-week cycle high. I've just said in this very simple diagram that I'm expecting the peak to occur early. Okay, so the next trough I'm speaking about is an 80-day cycle trough. John, I know, describes it as a 10-week cycle. It's the same thing. 80 days, 10 weeks, roughly the same thing. So as John is saying, the next 5-week cycle high, which is of course what I talk about as the 40-day cycle trough, might very well follow the Facebook IPO, the initial public offering of Facebook, and initial public offerings of really big companies like Facebook often happen at times when there are peaks formed in the market. Why? Because public sentiment is pushing the markets up, because they know it's going to be so exciting when Facebook start selling their shares, and what very often happens is that the shares get sold at the initial public offering occurs, and immediately the market starts dropping. Something that fairly often happens. So in other words, as John is suggesting, possibly the next 5-week cycle, which is a 40-day cycle, the next 5-week cycle will experience an early peak at the Facebook IPO. I'm not sure of the exact date of the Facebook IPO, but it would form a peak of the next 40-day cycle or 5-week cycle, and that would be the highest point that we would reach for the next 80-day cycle, followed by a move down into early summer. Possibly. It's a really interesting suggestion for what might happen. And I hope that highlights ways in which cyclic analysis starts opening up all kinds of possibilities. You begin to see how markets work behind the scenes, if you like. We know what's meant to be happening in terms of the cyclic picture, and very often news events and so on will fall into place to match the cyclic picture. I like quoting an example of last year when when I posted an article about how the market is likely to move down and there could possibly be an event which would be blamed for the collapse of the markets. And of course, 2 weeks later, the tsunami hit and hit Japan, and world markets took quite a tumble, and all the news channels were blaming the Japanese tsunami. But of course, I knew that it was the cycles and it wasn't the Japanese tsunami. The Japanese tsunami just happened to be the news event that happened around about the time that we were expecting the markets to turn down. So we are expecting the markets to turn down. We're expecting them to bounce up and then turn down fairly early, heading towards the summer, because we have the insight that Hurst cyclic principles provide us with. And news events will most likely fall into place around about that time. And as John points out, there will be news events that will occur that will be blamed for the fall in the markets. We don't know what they are, but they will most probably occur. So I just have another few minutes really on today's Trader Chat. It's been a fascinating Trader Chat for me. I've had an opportunity to talk about lots of terribly arcane and obscure things. I hope that you found it interesting. The last thing I'd like to do is go and take possible alternate analyses. And I've been playing around with, I'm always playing around with alternate analyses, and somewhere here in one of these charts I've got an alternate analysis. I think here it is over here. Let's have a look. This is just an analysis I was fiddling around with a few minutes before we started Trader Chat, and I think it might represent some of what John was saying. John said that he would place the first 10-week low in late November. And I think on this analysis, I have done that. There's the first 10-week low, what I call an 80-day cycle trough. 10 weeks, 80 days. Tomatoes, potatoes. So that's the 10-week cycle trough, or the 80-day cycle trough in late November. And then, as John says, he would position the 20-week low in late January. There is that 20-week low in late January. So, in fact, this analysis is the analysis that John is suggesting there, which is an alternative analysis of what might be happening. And again, if this surprises you, this very subtle trough for the 20-week cycle trough, I must remind you that the markets are never perfect. It's what makes her cyclic analysis so fascinating. Markets are never perfect, and it is quite possible that cycle trough, very subtle cycle trough, that very subtle price trough, could be a trough of the 20-week cycle. I haven't explored this analysis to extent. I literally finished this analysis a few minutes before we started Trader Chat, because I thought it might be interesting to look at it. I think that the most part of this analysis is most likely incorrect with the 40-day cycle over here. It probably, that 40-day cycle probably be moved to March over there, and I don't have time, sadly, to build an expert model right here live on Trader Chat. It's going to take a bit too long, but let me show you what I would like to do with this analysis, and I'll do it over the next few days. Is place the 40-day cycle trough over there. Okay, so we would have a 40-day cycle over there, and then we need to decide when to position the next 80-day cycle trough, and I suspect that we're going to position it either there or there, but let's measure that and see. That would be 71 days, which is 3 days longer than the average length, so that's a position. So it's most likely going to be over there, and if we have our 40-day cycle trough, that gives us 35 days. It is, in fact, a very perfect cyclic picture that seems to be emerging. So I think John might have given us the clue to a very good analysis here. So this would be 40 days, and I'll try and write the 40 days there. Or 5 weeks, and this is the 80-day cycle trough that occurred here in early April. So that would be the 80-day cycle trough, And so that means that we're in our final 8th cycle, falling into the next 40-week cycle trough that we're still expecting. And so let's just measure that. This cycle is already 28 days old, so it's quite possible that the first 5-week cycle, or the 34-day, the 40-day cycle trough has just occurred yesterday, so we're already towards the 40-week cycle trough. Okay, thanks, John. Go and fetch your kids from school. Thanks very much for joining us and contributing in so much to today's Trader Chat. And we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. And so just to wrap things up, okay, I presented 2 possible analyses in terms of what's happening currently in the markets. Now, let's point out what is the big difference between these 2 analyses. And in fact, the difference is really very slight. Okay, the difference is that in this analysis that I'm presenting here, what I could call John's analysis, okay, but with the 40-day cycle trough over there, the 80-day cycle trough over there, then what's happening now is the markets are falling down to a 40-day magnitude cycle trough, 40-day, okay, after which they're going to bounce for another 40 days before the 40-week cycle trough is going to occur. Okay, try and keep that in your mind. So we're falling into a 40-day cycle trough, might have occurred yesterday, or at least Monday, I should say, and then we've got another 40 days to elapse before the 40-week cycle trough. Now, how does that compare to the other analysis that I showed you initially? In fact, the only difference is that this analysis says that we're falling into a trough of 80-day cycle magnitude, only one cycle difference, 80-day cycle magnitude, and then we have another 80 days to elapse before we fall into a 40-week cycle trough. Now, I hope you can see, I hope that jumps out at you, how, in fact, 2 different analyses are saying something that is very, very remarkably similar. Okay, we're looking for a trough in the same period of time this week. We're looking for a trough. That trough might be a trough of the 40-day cycle, or it might be a trough of the 80-day cycle. Okay, and depending which analysis you choose, you would be, you'd be making decisions on that basis. It might be a trough of the 40-day cycle, it might be a trough of the 80-day cycle. After which, the one analysis says that we have only one 40-day cycle left to go for the fall into the 40-week cycle, whereas this analysis says we have an 80-day cycle to go for a fall into the 40-week cycle. The implications are the same. We are going to experience an early peak followed by a fall into a cycle trough of 40-week magnitude. That's a fairly big magnitude cycle trough, so we are expecting prices to fall, but it's not going to be the end of the world. Armageddon isn't going to happen early, but we are expecting prices to fall into a trough, which is expected, according to both analyses, pretty much early summer for the Northern Hemisphere. And that brings me to the end of today's Trader Chat. Thank you very, very much for joining me. Trader Chat. I do hope that you've enjoyed it. Managed to give you some insight into analyzing the markets using Hurst cyclic principles for those advanced users amongst us, and I see many of them with us today. I saw a message earlier from David, also in Canada, and from Blair. So great to see you today with us on Trader Chat. Thank you very much for joining me.